This was of course done by several organizations. You can see the blue shield symbol there. Biladi was our main local partner. It's an organization that is dealing also a lot with refugees from Syria. And they are working a lot on keeping up the identity for those refugees. They are teaching these refugees about their Syrian homeland. Just make sure that children don't feel suddenly that they are from another country, but that they stay actually Syrian. So this just shows some pictures of the blast and of the effect it had on town, but I think that is something which I think you might have seen. With the first explosion, and then you see the little explosions in it, which was probably the fireworks which were also stored at that stage. You saw what happened with the houses at the bottom, where just everything was pushed through. I mean, it's a very, I think it's very graphic and very, it's just, well, it gives a little bit the idea on what really happened there. This was not a normal explosion, that was something which was, I'm sorry, I'm trying to continue. No? Ah, there we are. And that was what the houses were looking like. The roofs were usually gone, there was a lot of debris. In the streets very often, the debris was up to 6 or 7 meters high lying in the street, so you just could, from the debris, look into the first floor of houses, because it was just so tremendously full. These were, you can see the structure of the roofs, and can imagine what this incredible explosion did with those roofs when it was lifting them up and then slamming them down on the structure of the houses again. I might just go over some of those pictures. What we did manage to do, and maybe try and be a little bit chronological in what we're doing, is we were working with an organization that had a lot of architects or architectural students in that organization. And we were approaching them, we have been working with them at an earlier stage. And we asked them to give us volunteers to start actually looking at assessing the damage that was happening to the different houses. We had immediately, on the third day, we had 40 architects that said that they were willing to work with us in this field. We had been starting before that as Blue Shield to develop a software. The difficulty very often when you have assessment of damage of different objects is the fact that there is no standardization of documenting damage. It was usually just the feeling that the individual that does the damage assessment has. So we were trying to create this software which was working mainly with scroll down elements of damage. So it was not purely the feeling of one of the architects, but it was a specialist putting in a standardized way, using a new software to document what was happening to those buildings or to the objects. And with that also we could document, of course, with pictures and an exact location, the damage that we were assessing, but then of course any measure that would be taken to limit that damage or as part of the reconstruction was something that we could also do on the same software. We shared that software, of course, with the Directorate General of Archaeology and Culture in Beirut. So with them we had a very good collaboration all the time, all the way. And we had a very good tool to have a starting point. The next starting point was, of course, as I mentioned before, the collaboration we had to find, or the coordination we had to find with the military, as well with the Lebanese armed forces, as with the UN troops there. So we could find out very fast from the trainings we had done before, what are the assets that the Lebanese armed forces have and what are the assets that the UN has. The UN had a lot of machinery that the Lebanese armed forces did not have, but of course their health and safety restrictions were much higher than that of the Lebanese armed forces. So we could use, so a lot of the soldiers from the Lebanese armed forces could do work with the help of the machinery that the UN had, which the UN could not do. So that was a very good collaboration that we had, but there had to be a coordination of that. And the coordination was handed, in this case, to Blue Shield. And I was the person in charge of doing that initial coordination between the military there. Of course, with my collaborators, I don't speak Arabic. I need the local specialist in this field, so it was mainly from the Blue Shield side and from the Biladi side. It was one of our archaeologists, Joan Farshach, who was then heading the main coordination there, also with the Director General of Archaeology and Culture. That was the precondition to do any type of work. Then maybe what you do remember is that a few days after the explosion, President Macron of France was visiting Beirut. And there were lots of demonstrations going on. And people were screaming, and they said, we need money, we need support, but don't give it to our government, because our government will steal it. When you have a situation that in a desperate situation like this, you have the population scream, don't give anything to our government, you know that this country is in a real dire strait. So none of the international funding organizations was willing to give any money to anything which was government linked. So the only possibility to go to give support was with international NGOs. Okay, that's an advantage for me, of course, in this case. But what was happening next? I was participating on all the UNESCO meetings that happened almost on a daily basis via Zoom at that time. You had people talking about what is the damage. There were lots of organizations, and you forgive me if I'm talking sometimes a bit negative about some others in this case, but the experience was quite grave. That thought, we are going to finance ourselves for the next decades with a case like this. So we are just putting numbers to it, which are completely outrageous. And the numbers which were from the damage that were at that time discussed was, they said, okay, the damage is in the range of 300 to 500 billion dollars. So if you give us 150 billion dollars, we can start reconstructing. But of course, asking an organization like UNESCO or even the World Society for 150 billion dollars is completely ridiculous. I mean, you can ask them for 10 times that or 1/10 of it. It is too much. Nobody has that money and nobody is willing to give it in a situation like this. So I made one point absolutely clear. I said there are a couple of foundations that can help and that are willing to disperse money, but in a very, very limited way. And I said in the beginning, we have the workforce, we have the administration. What we don't have is the material that we need. I'm talking about plastic panes to cover roofs. I'm talking about wood to actually create frames. I'm talking about corroded iron in order to create doors or things like this. I need the material. And I said, I will, as an organization, we will never ask for an amount to any sponsor to an amount that is 6-digit. It will always be 5-digit. So I said we will always stay under 100,000 because that can easily be controlled and the funding organizations can control it themselves. I'm very happy when they're doing this because I don't want any problems afterwards. And all the money will go completely into material that we are using with our workforce. And so we had 2 organizations that were helping immediately. It was on one side from Holland, the Prince Claus Fund. They are a fabulous organization. They give small funds, but they give them immediately. When they know you, they give you the fund in 48 hours. And I can assure you one thing, in a situation like this, when you have $15,000 or euros. At that moment, it is worth much more than $150,000 2 months later. Because that's what you can use immediately. It takes you a really long way. So we had three main sponsors. We had the Prince Claus Fund. We had a fund called ALIF, which is a state-sponsored fund mainly run by French and Italian. And we had the Norwegian embassy that also has a fund that was helping us, giving us the funds that we were able to work and start also working with some of the government buildings. And I will have quite a couple of pictures from one specific building, which was the biggest, let's say, historic building in town, which was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. All organizations said, we are not working with the government, so they were not willing to touch the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But we said, no, it's the biggest historic building in town. It's the Bustros Palace. It has to be preserved. It's an old historic building. Whether it's foreign affairs or not, that's not our question. We have to preserve it. And so we were asked at that stage that we would go in with the military and also preserve the Bustros Palace. So this was the first official building we did. And then of course when it comes to the private buildings, one thing which I found very, very impressive when I did my first walk on the third day after the blast, I came to a house. And there was a man standing in front of the house and he looked completely lost that the house was destroyed. And I started talking to him, and we were chatting on what happened. And I was asking him, can I have a look at your house? And he said, please, come in, absolutely. So I went into his house, and I could immediately see something which very, very much impressed me, which was the fact he was describing to me what happened. He said the explosion happened, he had 3 little kids, age between 7 and 11. And they were playing in the middle of the house, which is the living room, and it's open up to the roof. And there was a big chandelier hanging in the roof. So with the explosion, he himself was standing next to the door. So the door was pushed in, he was slammed at the wall, he was unconscious. The roof was destroyed, so the chandelier came down to where his children were playing, and he says by a complete stroke of luck, the chandelier got stuck with the electric wiring in there and did not fall on his children. But his children were getting, of course, a tremendous fright, and they were looking for their father, who was lying unconscious next to the door. They started running to their father, but of course, running to their father, they were barefoot. They were cutting their feet and their hands in a tremendous way. And they didn't feel it at the time because the shock was so big. But they were touching a lot of things. And so you had in the house, in the entrance, you had all these blood footprints and the bloody handprints that were all over the place. So that was a place which I thought was very significant and very important. Also, I hope you forgive me when I say that, to show the journalists, of course, to kind of raise the awareness on what was happening there. So I was using this house as an example and said, from the private homes, I want this house to have the roof fixed and have the windows and the door fixed as one of the first houses, because we want to use this also as a showpiece, so that this man can move back with his children, clear out the house, start with the restoration work, basically start getting active at that. So that was one of the houses in the main street in Mar Michael that we started also constructing. And so we had to choose, in collaboration, of course, always with the Directorate General, we had to choose which objects we were taking on and where we would take on the coordination for other organizations. This just shows a little bit the timeline that I was explaining to you, that we were applying for the funding. I told you a lot of those things. I'll try and get to the pictures. These were some of our architects that did some of the damage assessment. It was the organization UMAC who gave us the volunteers and looked after the volunteers that went around literally for 1 month from object to object and started to document what actually happened there. This was part of the I'm sorry, I'm just going over it because I don't know the presentation very well. As I told you, it's not my presentation, it's from the colleagues. There were some zoning was done in town in order to see which organization would look after which specific zones. This was how we could figure out, okay, now we are coming to an interesting element. I mean, one of the problems was what you can see here, for example, is typically the duct of air conditioning. The ducts of air conditioning were always proving to be an incredibly fragile part because of these huge types of pressures that were happening in two different ways, as I explained to you before, leading damage way down underground where there were cellars in houses. I give you an example which very much impressed me. That was one of the main museums, which is also in an old palace in Beirut, which was really very much destroyed. I'll show you some pictures later on. Was building 4 floors underground as storage facility for the museum, but also as restoration facility for the works of art. And through the lift shaft and through the air conditioning shafts, of course, the pressure was brought down. And there was, to the storage facility, it had a safety door, which was a 6-centimeter steel door leading into the storage facility. And the door would go to a staircase, and the staircase would lead out so that things could be brought to the storage facility. And that was, for me, it's something you cannot show on a picture, but you must imagine that. The pressure from the inside of the house, down 4th floor underground, was so big that it was rolling up that door, which was 6-centimeter steel, was rolling it up like a sardine can, and then slamming it into the ceiling where it got stuck in the ceiling. And I always try to put this in a context with the very few people that actually died, and the comparatively few people that were injured in this case. If you imagine the destruction that actually happened and the relatively little damage that happened. I give you one other, I don't have a picture of that, I know there's nothing in it. But very close to the explosion point was the main high-rise building, modern high-rise building of Lebanese Telecom. It's a glass building. As you saw, the explosion happened at a couple of minutes after 6. So until 5:30, there have been something like 650 people in that building, which is a glass building. After the explosion, there was nothing. It was a concrete structure, and every floor was empty. And at the time of the explosion, only one single person was in the building, and he was sitting in a bathroom in the middle of the central structure of that house, and he was just lightly injured, not gravely injured. It was astonishing. If that explosion would have happened 45 minutes before, there would have been 650 people dead in that building. This just to imagine. This is the Sursock Museum. That's the museum I was talking about, which was very famous for the windows it has, because the windows are normally very colorful. As you can see, the color is gone, but I will definitely find some pictures here that we secured the windows. Yeah, that was another palace. That was the typical inside we found when we looked at those buildings, at the destruction. No window, as you can see. The destruction is really unimaginable when you go about that. Let me see, I think this is a video that is probably showing. That's not normally how you should clear cultural heritage sites, obviously, but that's the Postpost Palace. That's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. of course, the saying that no compromise was something that was becoming very much the idea of the work that has to be done. Here we see the Sursock Museum. I was telling you about those wonderful glasses. That was the condition before the blast. That was the condition after the blast, when everything was just blown through. But that was the condition after securing the building. At least the windows were closed and they could start working on the insides again. This is the Sursock Museum. If you imagine, there you see the steel frame from a window. The window pane is out, but just the pressure that just pushed in that window frame in the most incredible way. That is typically the windows before and after. National Library. I mean, the most important thing was really that we said, what was amazing was the collaboration of the whole population directly after the blast. We could see, for example, very often if you would walk past a modern shop with a big window where they were basically showing their goods, through the way how the blast went, usually the pressure went on the inside and then pushed everything which was in the shop to the outside, which was lying in the street. And you could, at least for the first couple of days, see there was no looting going on. People just went and started carrying things, helping each other, carrying things back into the shops and trying to secure it. I'm not saying that absolutely no looting happened, because of course, after a couple of days also the looting started and the police had to take certain measures about it. That is obvious. And so it became also very interesting for us to close windows and doors, not only against rain, but also against what we call, let's say, outside intervention, which is translated as looting, basically. And here we were just capable of closing the windows and seeing that, you know, the roofs were covered so that the rain would just not pour in. And I think it's very important when they were talking about the circle of trust. I was telling you about getting finances for doing that. If there would not have been a collaboration beforehand and a deep understanding and trust with each other between the funders, the organizations that were participating, and also the state-run organizations that were working, the non-corrupt ones, it would not have been possible to do any of the work that we have been doing there. And of course, it was wonderful to see how the different soldiers, especially also in the UN forces, from all different nationalities, many of them could not communicate. So the general language in the UN troops was French, because it was a French detachment that was leading it, and of course many people in Beirut still speak French. And of course the Lebanese armed forces, they were speaking Arabic, so between those two languages and everything else, we had a big detachment also of let's say, Chinese soldiers that were working. And it was incredible the work they've been doing. So this is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Bustos Palace. This was the condition before the blast, and that was the condition after the blast. And just the size of the roof is absolutely tremendous. I will try and find one thing. I think there is somewhere there at least some of the debris was cleared. There is, I think that's quite interesting with the roof structure. You can imagine the importance. We had to work also with so many city architects that knew how to deal with the historic buildings there, to give us a hand, because they had all the material, that places that were particularly problematic. That is, I think, a very nice way where you see the damage, then it's the damage here, and then it's getting cleared, the roof is getting cleared, and then it's getting covered again so that it can withstand the elements. Yeah, that I really wanted to show you, because the Lebanese armed forces were doing this footage with a drone there, because they also wanted to show what they have been doing. You see the guys that are climbing on top of the roof, these were all Lebanese soldiers. So the UN soldiers for health and safety regulations were not allowed to get on top of the roof. Now if you imagine, you could see that the building was surrounded by high-rise buildings and how destroyed it was. You can imagine what the situation was in those high-rise buildings. It was quite impressive. These were training seminars we did later on with the soldiers to get their experience in what they found in it. This is the commander of the UNIFIL troops with the collaborators in the Sursok Museum. Okay, I really think that's most of. Yeah, that's more or less. Now, I have already used a huge amount of your time, so I apologize about that, but I will still use just 2 or 3 minutes more, just to say a couple of sentences about lessons learned. What have we learned from that? I think probably the most important element of lessons learned is that when you have something is happening, whether it's a conflict or whether it's a natural or human-made disaster, if you have a trained workforce, people you have been working with beforehand, that is an invaluable asset. It is a tremendous possibility that you have on being a first responder to any catastrophe that is happening of that sort. So I can only suggest to every country, to every committee, whether it is Röhrig, whether it's Blue Shield, to try and keep working on having people that are trained in the field, that know what to do, that have a certain coordination beforehand. It is a tremendous asset that you have at that stage. And of course, also what you need are the tools. I think one of the tools that we have developed there is basically the documentation tool that we have been starting to use there. We are already starting to use it in other places. All the material I'm getting from the area of Bergkarabakh currently about damage there happening to cultural sites is already entering into this tool. Of course, the tool is not necessarily currently available to everybody. It's not on the open web, if you want, because of course it can also be misused. So we are sharing with all institutions that can use it, that can work with it. Of course, we are very happily sharing it with them, but we are not making it completely openly accessible, because that would make it quite a bit too vulnerable. And therefore, having these tools, being prepared, is the most important thing that we can possibly do. And this is, of course, part of what I'm trying to achieve wherever I'm going, is asking everybody to participate in it and work on it. And I know that when I'm talking to friends from the Röhrig societies, this is material that is falling on very, very fruitful ground, because you know exactly what I'm talking about, because you in your tradition know about this since many decades longer than we are doing it. So thank you very much for your attention, and I apologize for having spoken so long, but we had so much time that they said I'm of course open to any questions that you have in this respect. So thank you very much.
Aitäh, suur tänu. Thank you very much. Kas meil on küsimusi?
Tervitan Röörichi pakti ja Rahuliku Eesti komitee nimel, tahtes öelda kõigepealt suur tänu selle dramaatilise ettekande eest härra Karl von Habsburgile. Ja kui me nüüd Eestisse mõttes tagasi tuleme võrdluses, siis võiks öelda, et teatud mõttes meile näib, et me elame siin nagu rahus vana jumala selja taga, kus kultuuriväärtusi ja pärandit ohustab põhiliselt ajahammas. Mis muidugi aeg-ajalt meile teatavaks saab, et siin-seal on mõni kirikutorn kokku kukkumas või mõne mõisa katus on tormiga õhku lennanud ja muidugi sellised väiksemaid asju, mida võib nimetada lokaalseks katastroofiks, meil ikkagi ka tunneme. kuid niisuguseid totaalseid katastroofe nagu see Beirutis ja mõnel pool mujal on juhtunud, hoidku taevas. Aga samas me oleme ikkagi ka Tallinn Beiruti ohukaaslane, sest ega meilgi pole tundmatu see odav põlluväetis, mis tuleb Venemaalt ja läheb läbi Tallinna ka küll Aafrikasse ja küll mujale. Ja tõenäoliselt osa seda ei kasutatagi mitte väetisena, vaid just nimelt leiab sekundaarse rakendusvormi lõhkainena. Ja kui nüüd need tonnid, mida nimetas härra Habsburg, oli nüüd 2275, kui see plahvatus toimus, siis kirjutati meie ajakirjandus küll 4475 tonni, 750 tonni. Ja siis meil Tallinnas toona oli umbes selline olukord, et Paljassaare laos ja Muuga laos võis olla kuni 10 000 tonni. Nii et enam kui 2 korda rohkem. Ja muidugi see on nüüd võib-olla mõned ütled, mis te nüüd, et me ei ole siin lõunamaa lohakuse kommetega ja meil on ikkagi euroopalikud tavad ja kombed. Aga ikkagi mingisugune tunne on siin kuskil kuklas ja üks Sulev Roosma nimeline mereala tegelane on ju aastaid pühendanud selle ammoniumnitraadi vastasele võitlusele, tülitades kõikvõimalikke ametiasutusi, aga erilise eduta, kuid nagu ma nüüd Aleksandrilt kuulsin, ikkagi Paljassaare ladu ei võta enam vastu ammoniumnitraati ja need vagunid ei veere läbi enam Tallinna Balti jaama sinna poole, et see ladu antakse säästva renoveerimise infokeskusele, et hoida seal ehitusmaterjali ja detaile, mis lähevad vanade hoonete restaureerimiseks nii olgu Tallinnas kui ka mujal. Nii et üks suur samm ohutuse suunas, vältimaks võimaliku katastroofi, on siiski toimumas. Nii et selle üle me võime õnnelikud olla. Aga meie, kes me oleme nüüd Röörichi ideede järglased ja pooldajad, peame muidugi tegema oma võimete piires tööd selleks üle pea, et kaitsta ja säilitada nii hästi materiaalset kui ka immateriaalset kultuuri. Ja selles osas olema internatsionaalsed ja tegema koostööd ka väljapool Eesti piire, sest et tõesti meil eestlastele paraku on tihtipeale omane ikkagi veel see teatud niisugune kapseldumise püüd, et püüame nüüd säilitada oma riigi ja oma keele ja kultuuri ja samal ajal siis nagu mõnikord hoidume sellest, et me vajadusest, et me peaksime saama tõesti maailma kodanikeks, sest need Röörichi ideed on ju totaalselt hõlmates kõiki kultuure ja rahvusüleselt, riigiüleselt, religiooniüleselt, poliitikaüleselt. See peab olema, kui meie kõigi hoiab. Ja muidugi meil ei ole praegu ka sellist organisatsiooni, mida esindab härra Habsburg, aga me loodame, et meie röörihilased, kes oleme ju näiliselt ainult puht humanitaarid, eks ole, suudame arendada ka koostööd meie politsei- ja päästeametiga ja sealt edasi kaudu ka sõjaväega. Et meil tekiks ka sellised üksused, mis vajaduse korral võiksid võib-olla mitte sõjakolletes relvadega, vaid ka päästetöödele, kui kuskil juhtub mõni suurem õnnetus, sest et meil ju ei ole vulkaane, meil ei ole suuri maavärinaid ja maalihked on ainult seal vanade kaevandustes tsoonis ja need on ka õige väikesed mõtmelised. Nii selle tõttu loodus on meid nagu üsna hästi säästmas, me võime selle üle õnnelikud olla. Aga inimtegevuse viljunes kunagi ja samuti võimalikud suuremad looduskatastroofid, rohkenevad ja tugevanevad tormid, mis muutuvad orkaanideks ja purustavad. Ja üleujutused, millest me oleme ka selle aastatuhandel juba osa saanud. Ja sellest ei saa vaikides mööda minna ja selle vastu peab midagi toimetama. Ja selle tõttu on hea, kui iga Röörichi seltsi ja komitee ja meie linna ja riiklike ametite vahendusel see tegevus omandab suurema baasi. ja muidugi mul on täna ka tõesti hea meel, et meenutati siin seda, et 90 aastat tagasi sõlmiti see Rööri pakt, eks ole. Ja meenutagem seda ja tänagem siis, et on olemas ka selliseid teisi organisatsioone, mis Rööri ideid on võimelised edasi kandma. Muidugi Rööri tõenäoliselt sündis oma aja kohta liiga vara ja toona ei olnud võimelised suurem osa riigi institutsioone mõistma, mida see kõik tähendab ja kuidas oleks võimalik ellu viia kultuurikaitset ja nagu siin Karl von Habsburg ka rääkis, eks ole, et ka konfliktide viisid on riikide vahelistelt sõdadelt läinud üle rahvaste vahelistele, religioonide vahelistele sõdadele, mis toob kaasa hoopis teistsugused ohud ja rääkimata siis puudutamata ilmselt kübersõjad ja rünnakud, eks ole, mis toimuvad ka. Nii et muutuvas maailmas on hea, et me saime teada niisugusest nendest selgustest. See laiendab meie maailmapilti, suurendab meie ohutunnet, aga loodetavasti paneb meid ka mõistlikult reageerima, aga mitte sattuma paanikasse. Nii et ma tänan ka isiklikult, ma tänan ka Rööri seltsi esimeest Irena Aleksandrovat, kes on Rööri liikumise hing meil Eestis ja kelle algatusel on tekkinud ka meiesugust ühendust, see on siis praktikomitee. Et püüame seda tegevust siis laiendada, ühendades nii hästi Eesti inimesi, vene inimesi, kes meil siin on ja teisi, kes on sama mõttelaadiga. Nii et tänan tähelepanu eest.
Kuna oli juttu ja kõlas nii sageli Röörihi nimi, siis lihtsalt tutvustuseks täna ilmus raamat Ljudmila Sapožnikovi Solest, teadlane, mõtleja, kunstnik, mis on pühendatud Röörihile. Nii et kui huvi on, siis selline raamat on olemas, võib nende mõtetega tutvuda. Kas doktor Habsburgile on küsimusi? Ja palun, teeme niimoodi, et daami käsi oli esimesena. Ja palun. Küsimused palun mikrofoni, sest muidu tõlgid ei kuule ja siis järgi mööda.
So thank you very much for this fascinating presentation and thank you for organizing this event for us today. First of all, as a comment to Mr. Kuuskema's note, I would like to say that I'm representing the Estonian National Heritage Board and as a matter of fact, the Estonian National Heritage Board has been working with different civil protection units, both the Estonian Police and Border Guard Board, and also the Estonian Rescue Board, in order to improve the cooperation between the cultural heritage side and the Estonian general cultural heritage side, as well as with the civil protection side. We're working in making closer connections also with the military. And as I'm being responsible for most of the topics that you discussed here, as Estonia being a very thin state, we don't have many experts on different topics. Many of what you said really touched me deeply, and I appreciate your work greatly. My question is about the Mount Karabakh conflict. As Estonia is also representative at the UNESCO 1954 Hague Convention Subsidiary Committee, we are tackling at the moment with sending a mission to the Mount Karabakh region just to even assess the situation there. And I would like to hear what are your thoughts on how the international community, international organizations and NGOs can help to improve the understanding of what in general is going on at the Mount Karabakh region and its cultural heritage. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to give a compliment back, because I have been several times to Estonia for special training with the Estonian military in cultural heritage protection. And that goes back to the fact that Estonia was one of the first countries, but you know probably much more about it than actually I do, about the documentation of listed heritage in Estonia. Was one of the first countries that had a full online registration with the, but you know this much better than I do. My problem at the time of the beginning when this happened was it was only in Estonian. And I wasn't able to read it. But I could see, and as my friends translated it to me, it was really excellent done, and Estonia was a real, very, very good example on what was happening there. And we always had a good relationship also. I mean, I haven't been here for a couple of years, but we had a couple of conferences in collaboration with the Estonian military, especially about cultural heritage protection. So I'm very glad to see how this is working. When it comes to your question about Karabakh, I'm a bit critical about this, because most organizations, and that includes, for example, UNESCO, is they want to go to Karabakh, which is currently controlled by Armenia. And actually, I don't know why everybody wants to go there, because the main historic sites are Armenian and they are protected by Armenia, and that is not really the problem. The area which is problematic is the area which is now Azerbaijan, and which is the surrounding area, where one also has to keep in mind the history of it, which I think is very important. Because for that area, we should not only talk about the Armenian heritage, we also have to talk about the Azeri heritage in this area. Because of course, this was an area which was Azerbaijan before, and only about 30 years ago, it was taken over violently by Armenia. It was occupied by Armenia. And Armenia started to do a lot of destruction in this area on Azeri sites. And yes, of course, I can imagine that right now there's a certain backlash, and I know from a couple of objects where there's a certain backlash, that now that it has become Azerbaijan again, that of course there are certain alterations, changes, damages, God knows what, happening to the Armenian sites there, especially when it comes to the language and the scripture and all of that. So the real interesting sites are not the ones currently controlled by Armenia, but the ones that are called, that are under the control of Azerbaijan. I think anybody who takes this history in their mind, they can to some way be successful in visiting those sites and go there. I have to say, of course, for the last couple of months, as you know, it was very difficult to get anywhere because of the crisis and the travel restrictions, everything which was happening there. There was one more thing that I was really considering in spring going there, but then I looked at the area, and there was still a lot of snow there, and the mining situation is terrible. And I've been working for 4 years in Afghanistan, and I know what the mixture between landmines and snow actually means. I didn't want to go there. I really would like to go there this year, especially now that there is an exchange of the mining plans that has happened over the last couple of days, or is in the process of happening. I hope this is helping a lot. It is not the ultimate solution, because we know from the military side always that, of course, minefields, when they are laid in the beginning, you know where they are, but very soon the knowledge about where the mines really are is disappearing very fast. And I've seen this in Afghanistan in a very intense way, what that means and what the weather impact also means on mines, that they're suddenly sinking into the earth, so they need more pressure to be blown up, and you think they are not there, and actually they still are there, or they are kind of exploding when you don't expect it. It's a very, very, very tricky area, and that will keep this region of Azerbaijan very busy for the next decades. It's nothing that is going to go fast in any way, but I think it is incredibly important to go there and document what is happening there, or what is there, what's the status quo, and to be able then to prove if there are any changes happening. So I can only suggest anybody who can go there, they should be going there, as we are planning it. But I always point out, most organizations say they want to go to Karabakh. I say, why? I mean, yes, I'm sure it's very beautiful, I want to go there too, but if I go there, I consider it tourism, I don't consider it work. And therefore, I really would like to go to the Azeri side, and that's something that also organizations like UNESCO should focus on.
Töötab. Mina olen Ivo Paulus ja olen päästes nüüd töötanud juba pea 27 aastat. ja selle aja jooksul on nähtud palju tulekahjusid just kultuurivaldkonnas. Ise olen kustutanud Pühavaimu kiriku torni 2002 aastal ja Vabaõhumuuseumis käinud tulekahjudel, aga sellist katastroofi nagu näiteks Rio de Janeiros, kus hävis Brasiilia rahvusmuuseum ja pea terve Brasiilia kultuuripärand, et seda õnneks Eestis ei ole olnud. Ja just nimelt õnneks, sellepärast et meil oli aastakümneid Tallinnas Kopli kaubajaam ehk siis raudteejaam, kus hoiti kütuseronge ja neid oli seal 12, 13 kuni 15 ja see plahvatus seal oleks siis käivitanud sellise dominoefekti ja et seal oleks ka löögi alla saanud siis seesama Paljassaare ammooniumnitraat ja meil käideldakse ammooniumnitraati Muugal ja ka seal on olnud üks õnnetus, aga ei midagi hullu õnneks ei ole Eestis juhtunud. Aga minu küsimus sulle puudutab turvalisust üleüldse, et see sinine lint, et te käite Malis mingile Tuareegi hõimu pealikule selgitamas, et mis on väärtuslik ja mis ei ole, et kui ohtlik see töö on? Aitäh!
Well, thank you very much for this question, because of course the answer is not easy. Yeah, it depends very much on the different society, how they are understanding what is important, what is culture, and what is their approach to culture. I think that's something which is very important. I can only talk a little bit about my personal experience in that field. I mean, the first thing that I try to explain everybody is that culture doesn't belong to them, but culture belongs to us. Culture is just something which belongs to humankind. It does not belong to an individual country or an individual person. They might be safeguarding it, they might be in charge of it, but it doesn't belong to them. They might be able to take decisions about it, but it still doesn't belong to them. So they don't have the right to destroy it. I give you very well. So I cannot give you a straightforward answer because I don't have a fixed recipe. But you just have to think about the situation with whom you are dealing, and you will find a way on how to transmit that information.
jah, olge nii hea, palun Aleksander ja siis veel üks küsimus kell 14:30 olete kõik arutanud, ma arvan, et doktor Habsburg hea meelega vastab meie küsimustele ka kohvipausi ajal, et siin saadus kõrval restoranis Konrad. Ja,
Aleksander Laane, et ma õiendaks ära ühe väikse sellise misunderstandingu tähendab kiire infovahetuse käigus. Et säästva renoveerimise infokeskus on tõesti saanud peale 2 aastast sellist pelgitagust tööd Lao Paljassaare tänaval, kus on siis väärtuslikud uksed, aknad ja muud sellised ehituselemendid. Aga see ei ole endine ammooniumnitraadi ladu, tähendab, ma ei julgeks pead anda, tähendab, et Paljassaares ei ole ammooniumnitraati või et selle läbivedu sealt oleks palju vähenenud. Aga kindlasti päästjad oskavad seda kommenteerida täpsemalt. Mul on üks selline lühike väike küsimus, tähendab selle märgi kohta. Et Amsterdami vanalinn on täis väga sarnast märki. Et kas teil selle Amsterdami vanalinna restaureeriva organisatsiooniga on ka mingisugused sidemed või on mingisugune koostöö? Ja teine küsimus puudutab seda, et aru saada, kuidas Liibanoni poliitiline süsteem toimib või ei toimi, et kas lisaks mainitud organisatsioonidele ja sõjaväele, kas teil mingisuguse poliitilise jõuga oli mingit sellist adekvaatset sisulist koostööd Liibanonist, kas nad kuidagi suhtestusid teiega? Aitäh!
Well, thank you very much. These were 3 questions. Some of them can easily be answered. The first question, which was not really mentioned as a question, but I think one has to say that ammonium nitrate by itself is not necessarily something dangerous. It is actually, you know that much better, but the flame point is very high. The problem is only when it's getting stored over a long time, also in humid environment. Then it really becomes very complicated. But ammonium nitrate on itself is not really a dangerous component. It only can be turned into a dangerous component. Yes, it should not be stored in big amounts in over a long time close to a town or to a settlement or to a historic site. Definitely not, that's completely clear. But actually, as a component, it's not a particularly complicated or dangerous component. There are sometimes some stuff that is much that is more dangerous on a smaller scale. It is only that, as I mentioned before, most of the really big explosions that have happened, man-made explosions, were based on ammonium nitrate. To come to Amsterdam, this is, I'm pretty sure, the work of the National Committee of Blue Shield in Amsterdam that is working on that. Of course, we are trying to, I mean, I know in Vienna we have it since a long time, but this is really the work of the national committees that they are doing. I only mentioned one case where we have been dealing purely from the point of view of Blue Shield as an international organization in putting up the signs. That was in Haiti. Because there, Haiti, after the earthquake there, I mentioned before the example with the cathedral, the question that was brought to us immediately was, wait a second, Haiti is not part of the Hague Convention. They're not signatories to the Hague Convention. Can they still put up the sign? And my argument, even without asking back, was that I said, of course, it's an international sign, and as such, it is recognized, or should be recognized, by any military personnel, but also by others, as showing a sign of a cultural object that should not be misused in any conflict. But it shows it's a cultural site. And that is basically the symbol. There are other symbols for cultural sites. There is the symbol of the World Heritage Sites, for example. There are different symbols that are in existence. This is the symbol that gets taught very much to military personnel, and during military training, the Blue Shield symbol is the one that shows it. I have to tell you a little story about that. And that is back considering how the whole thing happened in Austria. You know, in 1968 there was the so-called Prague Spring, where there was the uprising in Prague. The main military units of the Warsaw Pact or of the Soviet Union were stationed in Bratislava, but close to the Austrian border. And the most direct way to get to Prague, to bring troops to Prague, or additional troops to Prague, would have been across Austrian territory. And so the Austrians became very concerned on what was going to happen. What are the Warsaw Pact troops going to do to get to transport troops to Prague? Because we definitely, still under the influence of consequence of the Second World War, we did not have any troops to talk about in any way at the time that would be able to prevent this from a small neutral country. So what some members in the armed forces did at the time, they were going like, there is this Hague Convention, and there is a special symbol, the Blue Shield symbol. So we can use this amongst other things. And they printed on cardboard the Blue Shield sign. And they were putting in Russian, in German, in English, and in French the message that this is a cultural site that cannot be misused, and any misuse will be prosecuted. And they were printing thousands of those signs. And on the whole way between Bratislava and Prague on Austrian territory, I think they were nailing those signs to any tree that was older than 3 years old and declaring it a cultural site. What happened then? Of course, at the time, very few people knew about the Blue Shield. So what happened was that there was a meeting in Bratislava where an Austrian diplomat was participating in the event. And he was approached by a Russian general. And this general asked him, he said, you with your Blue Shield signs all the way up, do you really take this serious? And the diplomat, whom I still met at a later stage, who was in a very good diplomatic way, told me, he said, this moment, he had absolutely no clue what this general was talking about. But he had the presence of mind to say, this is of an incredible importance, any violation of any of this will be prosecuted and followed in the strongest way. So, I'm not saying that this was what stopped the Soviet troops to cross across Austria. But if this contributed just a tiny little mosaic stone to the overall decision to not cross Austria, it was definitely worthwhile doing it. And this was the initial point for the Austrian armed forces to start and use and teach and train and work with Blue Shield and the Blue Shield symbol, and basically create as the first armed forces in the world a specific unit that would only deal with cultural heritage protection during armed conflicts and start with the international training on that. So that was basically the starting point, literally, for Austria to do that. And as always, it needs an event like this in order to do something. To come to your question about Lebanon and other organizations. Yes, of course, we have long-standing connections, especially to, let's say, that state institution that is in charge of cultural sites in Lebanon, which is la Direction Générale d'Archéologie, which is the General Directorate for Archaeology and Cultural Sites. So it is a state institution, but I know them very well since many years. I know the Director General very well. And I can say I'm very cautious what I'm saying now, but I can assure, I am convinced that he does not have the level of corruption that most people in this government have. I have had very good collaboration with him, especially also in the last year after the explosion. Whenever I needed his support, I was getting his support, because very often he had to sign off, obviously, on things we were doing. We had a very good coordination, and it was him that put us in charge of coordinating all the military activity in Lebanon at that time in Beirut for the question of the reconstruction. So we have a good collaboration with them, but of course we also have a very good collaboration with many of the cultural institutions through, when I was describing to you what are the founding members of Blue Shield, which are the big cultural organizations like ICOM, ICOMOS, ICA, IFLA. Through those international organizations, we have, of course, a lot of contact and collaboration in Lebanon, especially through ICOMOS. Of course, they are very strong there because of the archaeological sites. We have a very good collaboration with a lot of those international organizations that are working there, because you have to see that what we are trying to do as Blue Shield is basically we try to do immediate rescue work. Yeah, there is a catastrophe, we are trying to go in, and we are the first responders. But I don't want to be stuck with Blue Shield. I don't want Blue Shield to be stuck for years in restoration efforts, because that is not our role, that's not our strength, that's not what we should be doing. We should be first responders, we should take the first measures for preservation, but then hand it over to other organizations that are probably doing a much better job than we do in restoration. We are not restorers, we are first responders. And I think that was also one of the elements that allowed an extremely good collaboration in Lebanon, because all the big organizations that want a long-term engagement in Lebanon after the explosion, they were never frightened by us, because they knew we would be out after 3 or 6 months. We'd be out of that. So our terms, literally, we were working until March, we were working there, and then we handed over to other organizations, because that's not our work, that's not our specialization. We are there as immediate first responders, as rescue workers, as immediate rescue workers, and that's where all the training goes, and that's where all our work goes. The restoration or anything like this really has to go to other organizations that are working there on the long term.
Thank you. I'm representing ICOMOS in Estonia, in Europe. And thank you for your exhaustive presentation. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask about legal consequences in Beirut. Do you think that the people in charge of keeping its ammonium nitrate in such conditions are going to be sentenced in criminal way. And you mentioned before this Mali case, which is more or less the first criminal sentence that is given, but as far as I know, it is well cited, but it is more or less the only one that can be used as international examples. And it somehow is comparable to UNESCO, where for years the state parties have been noticed that it is possible to drop off the list of World Heritage, but we only have Dresden and one site in Oman that really have dropped out. So my point is that if we have just like one criminal case in Mali, then it soon be devaluate itself in this case if we don't have any others. And can Blue Shield somehow influence this criminal consequences?
To come first to your question about whether I think that the people that were in charge of the harbor of Beirut will have to face legal consequences. I wish I could give you a positive answer. I really don't see it. Maybe they find a scapegoat that they are going to help. Because nobody really knows, or at least I don't really know, and I think I'll try to keep my ear on the ground on what really happened there. Who will have nobody really knows down to the last consequence on what happened there. I can give you the narrative, which is not very helpful, but it's the narrative that most people think how it happened. Most people think the ammonium nitrate was dumped there and nobody was going to pick it up. That was completely sure. It's too cheap. It's not worthwhile reclaiming it. It's not worth it. It was there for 7 years, 8 years. Some of the harbor workers probably thought, nobody's going to claim it. It doesn't belong to anybody. If I'm selling a couple of tons here or a couple of tons there, nobody will figure that out. I'll make a little money on the side. That's how it works. So probably they have sold off 10 tons, 20 tons. I have no idea. Yeah. But then, about 6 weeks before the explosion happened, there was a question in the Lebanese parliament about the ammonium nitrate storage there. So probably somebody was suddenly getting a fright and going like, how do I hide the fact that I have been stealing quite a couple of tons there? Oh, let me just burn it. And I'll burn the evidence and it's gone. And then of course, nobody who probably lit the fire was thinking that it was possible that it would have such a dire consequence because it has changed its structure in such a way that it became explosive. And that sounds to me like a very plausible story. I have no idea whether it's true or not, but it sounds very plausible. Yeah? We don't know whether it was 27,000 tons that exploded or whether it was 18,000 tons that exploded. Nobody knows that. We know the rough amount, but we don't know what happened there before. So who is responsible? There would be a political responsibility. I mean, if the government, even the caretaker government that is right now in charge in Lebanon, would have to take responsibility for their deeds, there's probably much worse stuff than the explosion in Beirut harbor there that they would have to be responsible. So am I optimistic about a political consequence of that? No, I'm not. I don't think it'll happen. But that should not stop people like you with ICOMOS, or me with Blue Shield, or everybody in here about Röhrig, or any other organization, to ask for it, to make sure there is a responsibility, to kind of demand for it and to point it out. I think that's very important. Am I optimistic about this happening? No, I don't think so. When it comes to Mali, it was the first case, but that was not a case in the ICC, but it was a case in the ICJ, or respectively in the criminal court, in the International Criminal Court for former Yugoslavia. Of course, it was the events in Mostar where the first time there was a conviction of a colonel at the time who had basically commanded the bombardment of the bridge of Mostar. And there were a couple of other convictions that are actually existing, very few. I totally agree with you about that. On one side, it's sad that, of course, any institution like the ICC is working very slow. On the other side, I'm not so unhappy about it, because some cases are brought there, but even many cases are dismissed, and I'm quite happy about cases being rightfully dismissed. I have been quite a couple of times that some of my colleagues are going regularly to the ICC in The Hague to train the prosecutors and to basically tell them what are we doing about cultural heritage protection, how do we proceed about that. And that's one way how we can help and also raise awareness about what is happening there, what's happening in this field. You can see that the ICC is becoming very much aware of that. There is one conviction, but there are quite a couple of cases that are actually pending right now, and where a conviction is pending for clear violation of cultural heritage. Now, I could become very complicated here and talk about interaction between the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, because of course many countries are not signatory countries to the ICC. It's getting very complicated. I think it's going very far too far. Otherwise, I'll talk to you for another 2 hours about that, and then you're all falling asleep. There's no point, including myself. So when I'm talking about law, I'll start to get bored by myself. But it is very complicated. It is a very long process. We know how long it takes. I'm very happy, having started my work before the ICC came to existence. I'm very happy we are having a criminal court that is able to prosecute things like this, and that is able to show that the violation of cultural sites and cultural objects for during conflicts is a criminal act. I think that's very important and already a huge step forward. Of course, for all of us, those steps go far too slow, but they're happening, and we have to live with it, and it's all our work that we are doing in raising awareness to making it go faster.
Aitäh. Aitäh. Aitäh, doktor Habsburg. Aitäh. Aitäh nende mõtete eest. Aitäh mitte ainult Beiruti eest, vaid ka laiema pilgu eest. Sellepärast, et kultuur pole ju ainult hooned. Kultuur pole ju mitte konkreetsed teosed. Kultuur on ka need mõtted, mis meil on peas. Nii et aitäh nende 2,5 tunni eest, nende mõtete eest. Mul on eriti hea meel nende kontaktide üle, mis võisid tekkida siin auditooriumis. Ja mitte ainult siin auditooriumis, vaid ka laiemalt. Homme doktor Habsburg on Tartus, nii et toimub ka rahulipu õnnistamine Jaani kirikus festivali raamides. Nii et kõik, kellel on võimalus ja aega, olete Tartus oodatud. Kuigi kontsertipileteid enam ei ole, ärge lootkegi, et te neid saate, aga võib-olla kuidagi ikka. Ja lubage teid paluda siia samas kõrvale Kodrat restorani kohvipausile või kohvi lõpule. Ja ma arvan, et kui kellelgi veel on mõned küsimused, mis ei eelda väga pikka vastust, siis vast doktor Habsburg lubab ennast tülitada. Ma millegi pärast arvan nii, sest inimesed, kes tegelevad kultuuriga, on reeglina leplikult ja vastutulelikult. It's true, jah. Aitäh veel kord, aitäh ja olete kõik oodatud. Aitäh. Leila tahtis paar sõna. Leila, пожалуйста.
Thank you very much for your time and patience. And of course, I wanted to close this session with the thank you words to the organizers of this workshop. This is Estonian Verifact Committee and the Estonian Relic Society. And it happened due to very tight cooperation between our NGOs, Austrian Relic Society, Austrian Verifact Committee. I'm a representative of this organization, but in the same time I'm General Secretary, yes, of the Blue Shield Austria, and this is the cooperation, the basic cooperation which allows us to work together, to support together on the level of expertise with the military and civil society experts, but also to engage more civil society to raise the awareness about the topics which are important for all of us. And I think that we are all today kind of reacted on things that were happening in Beirut, and this is the way how we can know about dangerous situations which can be kind of problems for our society in general and for our cultural heritage. It's on the one hand, so kind of awareness building is absolutely important, but it's also important to exchange experience, know-how, new developments in the field of cultural heritage protection. And I think it can happen on the level of governments, experts, international organizations, but also on the grassroots level, as it happened today as well. So I thank you, all of you, for coming today. I thank you, the Austrian colleagues, for allowing us to provide this workshop and share with you our experience.